Hi, my name's Greg Palumbo. I'm the executive director of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument on Cleveland's Public Square, and I'm welcoming you to the Cuyahoga County Soldiers and Sailors Monument podcast. With me today is Judge William Vodrey of the Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Court. He is also a former president and longtime member of the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, and is going to speak to us today about our Ohio wartime governors. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'm very happy to be here.
So, as we talk about our wartime governors, we have them prominently displayed in the monument. We have Dennison, Todd, and Brough, who I have been mispronouncing for a very long time. So, if you're out there and you've heard me say Brough, it is Brough.
It's a common misconception, but there were a number of contemporary sources. Of course, we have no recordings from back then, but there were a number of contemporary sources rhyming Brough with rough, specifically because he was kind of a rough guy. So that's how we know that it's actual pronunciation.
Yeah. So we start with Dennison. Where would you like to start? Do we start with Dennison? Do we start before Dennison?
I think we should start with Dennison, but there's certainly some background that would be useful. As you say, the Ohio Civil War governors were William Dennison Jr., David Todd, and John Brough. And each in his own way, these men really rallied and led one of the country's largest states during a time of unprecedented crisis, of course, the Civil War, but it was also a time of challenge and opportunity. And despite a very strong Copperhead presence in the state, Ohio's governors provided leadership which moved President Abraham Lincoln to simply but accurately observe, Ohio has saved the Union. And that's actually the only state about which he offered such praise.
Yeah. So the structure of Ohio's governors, we have three of them during a 5-year war, 4-year war. What is the political structure of Cleveland at the time, or of Ohio at the time?
Well, governors only served 2-year terms back then, and Ohio was, as many of us know from the Cleveland area, the northern part of it was inspired by the Western Reserve, so it was a very strong New England flavor to it. It tended to be abolitionist, but downstate, especially around Cincinnati, it was much more southern leaning. They were people who were, if not slaveholders, people who had very strong associations with the slaveholding states. And we have to remember, of course, before West Virginia became a state of its own, right across the Ohio River was Virginia. And Virginia was one of the prominent states of the Confederacy itself once the war broke out. And slave escapes across the Ohio River were quite common. Of course, that was featured in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Mm. And we have to remember that Ohio, although a free state by the laws of the time, still discriminated heavily, unfortunately, against Black Americans. And the Fugitive Slave Act meant that Ohioans had an actual legal responsibility to help recover runaway slaves, which, as you might expect, many people were morally absolutely opposed to. And slavery very strongly influenced Ohio politics at that time. Even if you weren't an abolitionist, were you considered sympathetic, at least, to the cause of African Americans? And many, unfortunately, in those days had no compunctions about being very outrightly and nakedly racist. And that was a major campaign issue in the time and very prominent in the politics of the time.
Yeah, so that leads us to Dennison, who is coming up through politics as an anti-slavery, anti-discrimination candidate.
That's right.
Can you tell me more about where Dennison's coming from?
Sure. Dennison was a young lawyer from Cincinnati. He graduated from Miami University and studied law, and he was admitted to the bar in 1840, so just 20 years before the outbreak of the war. As a state senator for Franklin and Delaware counties in the late 1840s, he had worked to repeal or scale back the so-called Black Codes, which were in essence sort of a mini Jim Crow, very strongly discriminatory against blacks. He opposed the admission of Texas as a slave state, and he opposed the extension of slavery in the Western territories, as did a young congressman from Illinois at that time named Abraham Lincoln. He spoke out in favor of those who'd freed the captured slave John Price in the Oberlin-Wellington rescue. And I, as an Oberlin graduate, I've always had a very warm place in my heart for those who showed the moral courage and subjected themselves to real serious legal penalties by being willing to take action to free an escaped slave.
Yeah, that's no small feat, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act, where it became not just difficult, but then illegal.
That's true. And I think many people have forgotten, it was not just your obligation not to block the recovery of an escaped slave, but if you were called upon, you were expected, you were legally required to actually help the recapture of escaped slaves. And as I said, a lot of people just hated that, and it became a major political issue.
Yeah. Jumping ahead a little bit, but once Dennison becomes governor, he does refuse to support the uh,
The return.
return of fugitive slaves
That's true.
to those states formally.
And takes a lot of heat for it, and is denounced throughout the South for by their lights, in refusing to enforce the law, and by his lights, by being true to the overall concept of the Constitution, which favors individual liberty. And of course, on moral and religious grounds, many people oppose the Fugitive Slave Act, and Dennison was among them.
Yeah, we talked about in an earlier podcast about the Ohio Territory having, from its foundation, always been a free territory.
Correct.
And that really is, as we've talked about, people coming from the north, from New England, as you say, into Western Reserve, and you have people coming from the south and populating southern Ohio. That was always codified that we are a free and always will be a free area.
That's quite true. And yet, the Black Code was in effect, and it was very nakedly racist and discriminatory against blacks. But many Ohioans, including Dennison, wanted to work to change that. And sort of the political irony of the Civil War is that by the southern states trying to secede, all of the representatives left Congress, so that in essence liberated Congress to then take action, and Ohio legislature and other state legislatures to take action to scale back, if not eliminate, black codes and discriminatory measures. And Dennison was very strongly in favor of that.
Yeah. So that kind of we've set the table for Dennison's election. Um, when he is elected, it's 1859. He's elected for governor in 1860.
He takes office in
takes office in 1860. What is the tenor of the country at that point? Are we, did everybody understand that this is headed toward this eventual conflict, or is it, with the election of Lincoln now it's accelerated and we didn't think we were going to get to that point? Did they elect Dennison knowing he was going to be in that kind of a situation?
I don't think they did, and I think the outbreak of the Civil War came as a genuine surprise to most people. There was a senator from South Carolina who early on, as the conflict was taking shape, before Fort Sumter had been fired upon with the actual military outbreak of the war, he bragged that it was going to be, what we would call a nothing burger. It would amount to really to nothing at all. And he actually said very famously or notoriously that he thought he would be able to mop up all the spilled blood with his handkerchief. It was going to be that much of a fizzle. Of course, he was very tragically wrong, but it was not unreflective of a lot of people's sort of inherent optimism that we'll be able to work something out. Shelby Foote noted that, of course, American democracy is built upon compromise, and this was sort of the circle that couldn't be squared, a compromise which couldn't be reached. And when all political measures failed, ultimately warfare broke out.
Yeah. What brings Dennison into politics? He's a businessman in railroads, which
Correct.
will be a running theme throughout all three of our governors here.
Exactly.
What made that leap from business to politics?
Well, he was a lawyer, and it's often been said that lawyers are sort of the larval stage of politicians. So not unusual for a lawyer to go into politics, just like me. But he was, I think, morally motivated by the issues of the day. He was very strongly anti-slavery. And yet he was, as the historian Eugene Roseboom wrote, radical enough to suit the radicals, but not enough to offend the conservatives. So, as is often the case, he was something of a compromise candidate. He was not too far to one extreme or the other that he could not appeal to the middle. He was a Whig turned Republican, just like Lincoln. And he had a very tight race against Rufus Ranney, who'd been a former justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. And Stephen Douglas came to campaign for Ranny, and Abraham Lincoln, at that point already with his eye on the White House, came and campaigned for Dennison. He did not speak in Cleveland, unfortunately, but he did speak in Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati. And in a close race, that might really have made a difference. Both Douglas and Lincoln were political rock stars of the day. And their Senate race, of course, the Lincoln-Douglas debates most notably featured in that, really seized the public imagination. And although Lincoln lost, as I'm sure you know, Greg, it catapulted him into the public eye and really laid the stage for his own run for the presidency.
Absolutely. What why do you think Lincoln chose to support Dennison over Rainey?
I think he recognized Ohio was a key state. Ohio was the third biggest state by population in the entire country at that time. He certainly, with his eye on the 1860 race and knowing that former Governor Salmon P. Chase was likely to run, I think hoped to collect some political chits and get some political goodwill by coming and campaigning for Dennison and having Dennison on his side if Lincoln, and Lincoln was a very shrewd political game master, thinking ahead, if he won the White House, it would not be a bad thing to have the governor of Ohio politically indebted or at least feeling kindly towards you.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. That's
then and now. I think any president would like to have a friend in the State House in Columbus.
Absolutely. So that I don't want to skip too far ahead in what Dennison does as governor before Lincoln's inauguration, but we do know that Lincoln takes his 13-day journey from after his election.
Yes.
Across the northern cities, holding these 13 rallies in 13 states, 13 cities over 13 days.
Correct. Including from the balcony of the Waddell House right here in Cleveland.
Yeah, right here in Cleveland, which we do have a marker in our monument that will hopefully be dedicated outside soon, but is inside the monument at the moment, talking about that trip and then his eventual return and his funeral train. But on his way to his inauguration, he stops in Columbus, and Dennison has quite a to-do.
Yes.
For Lincoln.
Yes, there's an enormous, very crowded reception for him. One contemporary account said that the crowd was, quote, frenzied in their attempts to shake the president-elect's hand. You can only imagine what that might have been pre-Secret Service. And Lincoln was certainly jostled and sort of hemmed in by the crowd, but he, by all accounts, took it with pretty good grace. A very young Rutherford B. Hayes, as it happens, was there and got to meet Lincoln and see him at close range. Hayes was actually disappointed that Lincoln seemed to be oddly dismissive of the movement towards secession, which was already by that point very apparent. And we have to remember it was not any overt act by the United States that led to the Confederate attempt at secession. It was the simple, lawful election of a president. But it was a president-elect who had promised to do his best to limit the expansion of slavery, not to abolish slavery. Lincoln was not an abolitionist by the standards of the day, but he was firmly committed to stop the expansion of slavery into the West. And that alone, as the resolutions of secession show in many of the southern states, was enough to spur their attempt, if I may say, their treasonous attempt to break up the country, to pull their states out of the Union.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk about this in the monument when we talk about Dennison and Lincoln. As Lincoln's in Columbus, Dennison is said to have gotten the telegraph stating that Lincoln had officially been elected.
The Electoral College
by the Electoral College. Lincoln is said to have been sitting at Dennison's desk when that happens, and that same desk has been used by every governor since, including Mike DeWine today. We try to get that into our narrative in the monument. At the time, there was the pomp and circumstance wasn't necessarily viewed as such a great thing for the governor to be showing such opulence and into the late hours of the night. From what we heard.
Yes, well, there was certainly a democratic with a little d ideal that one of the reasons the president-elect was jostled was it was thought almost too royalistic or unbefitting of an infant republic for the president to be surrounded by a phalanx of guards. Of course, the Secret Service did not even exist at that time.
Right.
And there had only been one known assassination attempt against a president up to that point, Andrew Jackson, who was peppery enough that he immediately attacked the guy who was trying to shoot him. Both of the assailants' pistols misfired, but that was regarded as sort of an aberration.
Mm.
And I believe it was William Seward who said, assassination has there's no tradition of that in the American political ethos. There's no particular reason why the president would be at risk. Although I think Lincoln deep down knew better. He actually kept a file once in office marked assassinations.
Yeah.
And it was a collection of all the threatening letters that he received. But there was still, Lincoln was, as president-elect and even as president, unfortunately, once war broke out, was horrifyingly, I think, by modern standards, uh, uncareful, if you will,
Mm.
about his own personal security. And when he was finally very tragically killed at Ford's Theater, given how careless he had been with regard to his own personal safety, I'm afraid it can't be any particular surprise.
Yeah. So, well, we'll go back to Dennison now. Dennison as a war governor. So war does break out. Dennison is in office when that happens. What do we think of Dennison as a war governor?
He was a good one. The Ohio Senate was actually in session on April 12th, 1861. Was just conducting a quiet day of legislative business when a state senator with a telegram in hand burst in the chamber and said, "Mr. President, the telegraph announces that the secessionists are bombarding Fort Sumter." And the stunned senators sort of sat there for a moment, and a woman in the gallery shouted out, "Glory to God! Glory to God!" It was seen as sort of the breaking of the dam, and finally we're going to have an outcome to that. We're going to have a resolution of this
Mm.
ongoing crisis. Slavery versus freedom, abolition versus protection of slavery, threats to secede versus the imperative that Lincoln and many others felt to preserve the Union. And finally, Senator John Sherman, among others, noted, at least we know what we're into now, and we can sort of turn our attention full scale to the war. And the Cincinnati Gazette at the time observed that the first shot fired by the revolutionists consolidated Northern sentiment, and there is now but one opinion among our citizens, and that is in favor of the Union. I think that's an overstatement.
Mm.
Party differences certainly persisted, but at least in the initial days after Fort Sumter, to the extent we can gauge public opinion pre-Gallup, there was a strong sentiment that the Union must be preserved and the secession should be put down.
Yeah.
Governor Dennison told the War Department that instead of the 13 regiments they said of infantry that they said they'd like him to raise, he was going to raise 22. And then he couldn't even stop short of 22 without, as he put it, seriously repressing the ardor of the people, unquote. He had a very small staff. He himself had no experience at previous military administration, but of course the Constitution made him commander-in-chief. The state Constitution made him commander-in-chief of the state militia, and he set out trying to bring order out of chaos. He asked the General Assembly to appropriate funds for mobilization, and within 3 days, remarkably fast action, they had authorized a war loan of $1 million, which in 1861 funds is a huge sum, and it was more than twice what Dennison had actually asked for. And the bill passed unanimously in the Ohio House. When's the last time anything has ever passed unanimously in the Ohio House of Representatives? So Dennison did his very best to sort of organize in a very chaotic time the Ohio response to the outbreak of war. There was a very small standing U.S. Army at the time, and it was far more the custom, as you know, Greg, that state militia units, once organized, would then be sworn into federal service.
Yeah.
They would still maintain their unique state designation. Of course, they took a lot of pride. We're from Ohio, we're from Iowa, we're from Pennsylvania, wherever else, but they were sworn into federal service. Initially, the War Department, ironically, given the later difficulties with recruiting, the War Department refused to accept any more troops than those initial 22 regiments. And Dennison did his best to cut through red tape. He gave his purchasing agents very broad latitude. Of course, he was then denounced for being wasteful and profligate. Sure. But then if he tried to be deliberate and careful, of course, he'd be blasted for dragging his feet and keeping vital supplies out of the hands of the troops. So as ever in politics, somebody's always going to criticize you whenever you're trying to do something.
Yeah. He doesn't have any military experience. He's trying to bring people around him that are going to be able to provide that experience for him. One of those men is coming through the state on his way to Pennsylvania. His name is McClellan.
That's right.
He hires him on the spot. What was the relationship between Dennison and McClellan? Do you know
I don't
what
think that
they?
they knew each other before then, but I think McClellan's reputation certainly preceded him. And McClellan, for all his many, many other faults, and I'm not a fan of George McClellan by any means, he at least gave the impression of calm confidence.
Hmm.
He did have military prior experience. He was a railroad man, just as Dennison was. And I think that all appealed to him. And McClellan was one of four generals that Dennison appointed to leadership posts in the state militia. One of the other two, who will be heard from later, was Jacob Cox, who would go on to another graduate of Oberlin, I'm happy to say, and he would go on to glory, especially at the Battle of Franklin in 1864, and he would in time become governor himself.
Yeah, if you want to look more, if you want more on Jacob Cox, Jacob Dolson Cox, you
You know
can
his middle name.
you can go
Bonus
back to
points.
one of our previous podcasts. So go back to our podcast on presidents. We talk about him quite a bit.
Good.
Yeah, and he is also represented on our monument.
Another initiative, if I may say, that Dennison undertook was to send the Ohio militia into Western Virginia, which was
Mm.
not yet its own state. And a journalist later, Whitlaw Reid, said that West Virginia was the gift of Ohio through her state militia to the nation at the outset of the war. Western Virginia tended to be more anti-slavery. Slavery in the more mountainous country had not really taken root the way it had in the flatter lands to the east with the plantation economy. And the Western Virginians early on made it pretty clear they did not want to be swept along the
Mm.
secessionist tide. And they were, if not welcoming, certainly not averse to the presence of Ohio troops there to protect them against Confederate troops. And in time, pretty much a direct through line
Yeah.
leading to statehood for West Virginia.
And that's something that Dennison does without the request or approval of the federal government, is to
Correct.
send those troops to protect the conference that is forming the new West Virginia.
Correct. The Wheeling Convention. That's quite right.
Uh, so he raises those troops in mass, Ohio being the highest per capita volunteers, and they go on to fight gallantly. He does not, however, get the nomination for another term.
That's correct. Remember, Ohio governors served only 2-year terms at that time. I think Dennison could probably already see the way the political tide was flowing, so he sort of looked for a lateral move, or maybe a promotion, if you will, and that was to the U.S. Senate. Since President Lincoln had appointed Salmon P. Chase to serve as Treasury Secretary, that opened up that seat. And Dennison wanted it, but he, by that point, I think had already irritated enough people by taking necessary measures to get Ohio into the war and contributing productively. And Ohio Republicans in the General Assembly. Of course, in those days, U.S. senators were picked by the legislature.
Hmm.
It did not go to a general vote of the people. And John Sherman, who was future General William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, got the seat instead. But it took no less than 78 ballots for the seat finally to go to Sherman. So there was considerable support for Dennison.
Yeah.
But he was not able to seal the deal and finally get that U.S. Senate seat, which would have been a great move for him from the governor's office, but it was not to be.
Yeah, we talk about a lot about our party system, and we talk about Republican versus Democrat quite a bit, and we don't realize that there were other parties at the time. Dennison starts as a Whig and becomes a Republican in this new Republican Party. But during the war, we find an alliance between the Republicans in Ohio and the war Democrats.
Correct. And they called themselves the Union Party.
The Union Party.
And most people had the thought that really didn't take hold until 1864, when, of course, Lincoln was not technically the Republican. Well, he was the Republican Party nominee, but he was running on the Union ticket with a war Democrat, Andrew Johnson, who, of course, would himself become president in turn. But Ohioans led the way, and that was in 1861. I mean, the first full year of the war. And that was in forming Union Party, and it was playing a vital role in Ohio politics even before it did on the national level.
Yeah. So Dennison doesn't garner the support of that alliance. He does not go into the Senate.
Correct.
And where does that take him from there?
Well, after that, he was appointed Postmaster General by the president, which was a very significant patronage post at the time. We think of the Postmaster General now as just sort of leading the postal bureaucracy, but at the time, the Postmaster General was actually a member of the president's cabinet. because the Postal Department before the war was far and away the largest federal employer. You've got all those mail carriers, you've got all those postmasters and postmistresses and so forth. Whoever became postmaster general was typically a close political ally of the president and somebody who could be relied upon to use the post office, the postal department, to find jobs for people of your party.
Yeah.
So Lincoln entrusting that to Dennison was a major mark of confidence, and Dennison stayed in the job through the end of the war.
Why does he eventually leave the job?
He leaves the job because after Lincoln's tragic death and the succession of Andrew Johnson, who shows up on very few lists of wonderful presidents, he becomes increasingly distanced and dissatisfied with Johnson's leadership. Johnson, although strongly anti-secession, also does not have any particular interest in taking action to protect the rights of freed slaves in the South. He is recorded now, we can see, for having made a number of racist remarks and sort of shown his antipathy towards the interests of African Americans. And I think that rubbed Dennison the wrong way, even putting aside, his basic political disagreements with Johnson in many ways. And Johnson was just tended to irritate everyone around him, and he eventually drove everybody out of his cabinet who he had inherited from President Lincoln, other than Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, and William Seward, the Secretary of State. And Dennison was among those who made an exodus from the cabinet. And I think it could be fairly said that Johnson pretty much drove him out.
So he comes back to Ohio, serves on the Columbus City Council. Talk about quite a step down.
It is. But Hannibal Hamlin, who was vice president, ended up as collector of the port of Portland, Maine, which you would think is a significant drop in status, but it happened to be a much better paying job, so he didn't complain too much about it.
That's pretty good. But his political aspirations are not over. He does make another run at the Senate.
Yes.
In 1880.
Yes, and again falls short.
Yep. And falls short to a future president in James Garfield.
Correct. Who still remains the only person elected direct, although he was elected a U.S. Senator, he was not actually sworn in, and Garfield remains the only individual ever to be elected directly from the U.S. House to the White House.
Oh. So now we're moving to who that political appointee was. I shouldn't say political appointee, who the political machine chose to be the next governor of Ohio.
Yes, that was David Todd, who was a lifelong Democrat, not a Whig turned Republican. And he was born and raised in Youngstown. He'd attended Burton Academy in Cuyahoga County and studied law in Warren, and had himself served as a postmaster. He was a railroad guy as well, an investor, very ambitious guy. He'd actually run unsuccessfully for governor in both 1843 and 1845. But then he served ably, by all accounts, as U.S. minister or ambassador to Brazil, and he was appointed to that by President Polk. He'd actually chaired the Democratic Convention in Baltimore in 1860 that had nominated Stephen Douglas. Of course, as you know, the Democratic Party split that year between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. The North, Stephen Douglas, the standard bearer, and in the South, it was John C. Breckinridge, who had been President Buchanan, the previous president's vice president. Todd had supported the Crittenden Compromise, which was sort of a last-minute attempt to stave off secession by explicitly providing that slavery could expand into the West. For many reasons, as you might expect, that was adamantly opposed by a number of Northerners, not least Abraham Lincoln. And David Todd had warned a Republican friend that attempts by Ohio troops to subdue the seceding southern states might actually be blocked by Ohio Democrats. So I think he really misread the political situation in 1860. By 1862, however, the wheel had turned. Todd, by that point, had addressed a number of mass meetings as the seriousness of the crisis became apparent. And as I think he saw which way the political wind was blowing, he promised Lincoln that 200,000 Ohio Democrats would stand with him in crushing treason and rebellion, as one historian noted. And another historian, Eugene Roseboom, who I mentioned earlier, said it was Todd's fate to have the gubernatorial prize, which had twice eluded his ambition in his younger days, come to him without effort in middle age. because he had risen above partisanship in a great national crisis. And he was just a month shy of his 57th birthday when he was sworn in.
Mm. So where does Todd come?
Todd was himself from Youngstown. He, as I said, was a railroad guy. He'd been actively involved in Ohio Democratic politics, but the political tides had shifted such that he was appealing to those who, even if they could recognize the good work that Dennison had done, they also thought it was time for a change in the governor's office.
He comes from a political family. Todd does. His father moves to the Western Reserve and gets into local politics, and then eventually is appointed as a um, Ohio Supreme Court justice.
Oh, I had not known that.
Yeah, in 1807. So he's no stranger to politics, and as you said, he had tried to become governor twice before.
Twice.
Ran on a very anti-national bank platform,
which was very true to the Jacksonian ideal at the time. Of course, Andrew Jackson got a lot of attention for taking on the Bank of the United States, and banks were seen then and now to some extent as sort of the embodiment of the financial elites, people who are out of touch with ordinary people and are in it only for their own monetary gain. Not surprising for any bank, but in political terms, certainly it was a real vote getter for any Democrat of that era.
As a wartime governor, he's coming in, taking over for Dennison, who had geared up the machine quite well.
Correct.
And now comes in as commander in chief of a sizable militia
That's
that
right.
is feeding into the federal system. What does Todd do of note during the war period?
Well, Todd is very smart in that he keeps most of Dennison's staff. He does not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. He sees the good that Dennison has done and builds upon that. And of course, he has to. It's in the middle of the Civil War. He really doesn't have either the time or the interest in reinventing the wheel and doing it all over again. So he builds upon the strengths of Dennison's effort to date. He finds that Dennison's plans to improve Ohio's contribution to the war effort were, in many cases, just reaching fruition. So he is able to reap the benefit of that as well. He was hard pressed to keep up with the War Department's, by this point, resumed demands for more and more troops. The war was, notwithstanding what that South Carolina senator had thought, the war was unbelievably and unprecedentedly bloody and costly. And the War Department, after the initial confidence that we've got all we need, don't worry about it, was going back to the states more and more and saying we need more and more troops. Todd was able to keep the wheels turning. He worked very effectively with the Steubenville-born second Secretary of War, who Lincoln brought in, the extremely confident and capable Edwin Stanton. And they had very cordial relations. They knew each other from Ohio Democratic politics. And Ohio was actually able to avoid participation in the first draft when it was introduced in 1863, because Todd was, just by encouraging volunteerism, volunteer enlistments, was able to keep enough troops coming in that Ohio did not have to be subject to the draft, which was, as you probably know, extremely unpopular, most notably in New York State. We had the July 1863 draft riots, which anybody who's seen Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York knows that was no picnic. Ohio, fortunately, was able to avoid that, in part because there were still sufficient volunteers to come forward and fulfill Ohio's enlistment quota.
So, do we have any politics going on at this time? I mean, the war seems to be so encompassing. What's happening on the ground in Ohio?
Yes. Well, of course, politics goes on no matter what, and it's part of the genius of American democracy. We had elections all the way through the Civil War. If we had not, unfortunately, I'm afraid we might have fallen prey to what happened to far too many other countries faced with civil wars. That a dictator seizes power, elections are canceled. That fortunately did not happen in the U.S. Plenty of problems with American democracy, plenty of problems with Ohio politics at the time, but the basic democratic with little d processes went forward. The recruitment of black troops became a major political issue. A lot of the racists or anti-black politicians of the day were adamantly opposed to it. Todd himself had not been an abolitionist by any means. His views were considerably more conservative on that front than Dennison's had been, but he also recognized reality. And other states, such as Massachusetts, anybody who's seen the movie Glory, the first state to raise a black unit. And Todd sort of bowed to reality, and he eventually recruited former Governor Dennison to come back and to help recruit black troops. Casualties were rising. Volunteers were still coming forward, but not in the kind of numbers that the War Department kept demanding, so it only made sense to recruit black troops. The African American population in the U.S. And in Ohio was substantial, and why should we not make use of this great resource? These men who are ready, willing, and able to serve. And Todd came around to that point of view. Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, though, in the fall of '62, came out in September before the November elections. It really hurt Republicans, unionists, if you will, in the state in the fall legislative elections. And Ohio Democrats in '62 won 14 of the state's 19 congressional districts, which was not at all the kind of political signal that the Lincoln White House wanted to see.
Yeah. As we're heading toward the end of Todd's service as governor, we see him on the podium with Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address. He is, standing in to show the prominence of Ohio in the war effort, which we've covered. Why is Todd not? Why aren't we continuing with the way things are and just keep rolling right along with Todd?
A number of issues, including he, in essence, had the same thing happen to him that had happened to Dennison. He had to make a number of unpopular decisions. He had to twist some arms to have Ohio meaningfully contribute to the war effort. And he had irritated just enough people, just enough political movers and shakers in 2 years in office that people were ready for a change. And Todd, just as Dennison before him, sort of outstayed his welcome. Yeah. In particular, he was hurt by the raid of Confederate General John Hunt Morgan. Morgan led 2,500 rebel cavalrymen across southern Ohio, a bit of Indiana as well. Todd caught out the militia domestically within the state, which was very unpopular. Morgan was able to ride across 21 of Ohio's 88 counties, so a lot of people thought, what are you doing? Why couldn't you stop this guy before he cut this swath across southern Ohio? About 50,000 Ohioans of the militia took the field against Morgan, and as one historian wrote, not half of them ever got within 60 miles of their quarry. And General Morgan finally surrendered, not so much because he'd been militarily defeated, but just because he was exhausted. He and his remaining troops had just been on the run, on horseback, but,
Sure.
continuously chased across 21 counties without ever really the chance to stop and rest and certainly get any reinforcements across the Ohio River. That wasn't going to happen. But Todd did not get much credit for that. And it turned out later that a number of claims were filed against the state by farmers whose horses had been stolen to provide new mounts to Morgan's men. Their barns had been burned, or crops had been confiscated, and so forth. And the final claims against the state to sort of fix the damage done by Morgan was over $1 million. And again, that's a lot of money back then.
That is a lot of money.
And one critic said that Morgan's raid might actually be more accurately called Todd's military elephant, like a white elephant, but this burden that he bore. It also didn't help that he had approved the military arrests of 11 Ohioans for subverting the war effort. I mentioned Copperheads earlier. These were peace Democrats. People, politicians, and civilians in the North who opposed military efforts to suppress the Civil War, who typically were either pro-slavery or at least sympathetic to the South, who did not think it was worth the huge expenditure in blood and treasure to try to bring the southern states back into the Union. And a very prominent one was Clement Vallandigham, who was a former congressman from Dayton. And Todd, it came out, had, if not raised no objection, might actually have asked for the arrest of several Ohioans. And as after 9/11, it was very controversial that civilians, even in wartime, might be tried before a military tribunal when the regular U.S. district courts were still open for business. And that became a major criticism against Todd as well. He did very well, just as Dennison did, in the actual logistical matters of supporting Ohio troops. He sent a hospital ship at state funds to Shiloh in 1862 after the battle there. He chartered 11 other steamboats as mobile hospitals by the end of the year. He sent special state agents to the cities to help disabled soldiers obtain back pay, bounties, and pensions. He arranged for additional state funding for removal of sick and wounded Ohioans from combat zones when, in his judgment, Uncle Sam wasn't doing the job well enough. And he actually, by the end of his term, won the nickname the soldier's friend, which he really relished. And that reflected he was doing very good work, even if the politics were very tricky for him, very difficult. And indeed, by mid-June 1863, it had become clear to him he did not have the support to win re-election.
So that brings us to John Brough.
That's right.
Who's governor from 64 to 65.
Correct.
Where is Brough coming from, and how does he end up in the political zeitgeist to be able to take over Todd's spot?
Right. Well, Brough was just 52 at that time. He was another Ohio Democrat who'd become a Union candidate. He'd been living in Indiana for several years before he was elected, and he had thus conveniently not irritated anybody of political note in the years before the Civil War, and was thus not particularly objectionable to anybody when he stepped forward. He was a railroad executive, just as Dennison and Todd had been. He was described by Walter Havighurst, a noted Ohio historian, as being, quote, a big bull of a man with driving energy. He was a blunt, outspoken, rude man who loved to chew tobacco and thus presented quite a contrast with his two handsome and dignified predecessors, as one historian said, referring, of course, to Dennison and Todd. Brough had been an orphan at age 11. He became a printer's apprentice. He received 3 years of part-time education at Ohio University. He rose to go into newspaper publishing as well in Marietta and Lancaster, Ohio. He entered politics, served 2 years as clerk of the Ohio Senate before he being elected himself to the Ohio House of Representatives in the Fairfield-Hocking area. There, he was by no means an abolitionist. He promoted fugitive slave bills. He attacked abolitionism. He supported the Black Code. He was by no means seen as somebody likely to fall in with Lincoln's eventual goals of limiting the expansion of slavery. On the personal front, his waistline expanded to a point where a political critic said he was as big as a load of hay. And Brough said that he felt like one, quote, judging by the number of asses that were nibbling at him, unquote. So he was a very earthy, down-to-earth man of the people, salt of the earth. And he had opposed Lincoln's election in 1860, but he refused to criticize the president once war broke out. And in June 1863, very politically opportunely timed for him, he gave a very strongly pro-Union speech in his hometown of Marietta. And he declared that despite his past political differences with Lincoln, quote, like a soldier, my duty is to obey the president. He admitted that he had not approved the Emancipation Proclamation, but he thought that slavery was bound to perish in the war. He also backed up Dennison and Todd. He justified confiscation and military arrests given the crisis that the country was facing, and he appealed to patriots of all parties to unite against Southern insurgents. And Brough's backers, who already had their eye on the governorship for him, made sure that his speech was printed and very widely circulated. And that was not uncommon in politics of the day. You know, what you thought was maybe your best speech would be printed out in pamphlets, pre-television, pre-radio, and then widely distributed to voters. And you try to build support for your candidacy that way.
Yeah, and as you said, he is a journalist,
Yes.
so he knows how to work that kind of a system as well. I found a couple of interesting notes on Brough that when he was serving as the clerk to the Ohio Senate, he was also serving as his newspaper's Columbus reporter, and
That's some keen insights that way.
And for another newspaper as well as a columnist on the political beat. So that was interesting.
Multitasking,
double dipping, yeah, a little multitasking there. And then I also found that he bought. I personally, and people know, I'm a Bearcat myself, went to the University of Cincinnati, know the Cincinnati Enquirer very well, and he, in 1841, with his brother, bought that paper, the Cincinnati Advertiser, and turned it into the Cincinnati Enquirer.
Very good.
So it's, he is our last governor to be elected not of the Democratic or Republican Party.
I think
Did you
that's
know that?
probably true. Yes,
He was of the Unionist Party.
exactly.
Uh,
Which was a wartime cobbled together coalition between Republicans, many of whom were former Whigs, and
mm.
war Democrats.
He did have a hard-fought campaign, though,
He
for
did.
governor.
But before he got there, Governor Todd was not going to go without a fight. Unlike Dennison, he actively strived to win the nomination again. He lost 216 to 193 to Brough. Todd complained to the president that, quote, personal considerations alone were the cause of my defeat, unquote. Now, he was by that point tired and worn out. He had really put his all into the governorship, and of course, being a wartime governor is challenging for anybody. And Lincoln recognized that and offered Todd the Treasury Secretaryship after Salmon P. Chase, also of Ohio, had resigned in 1864. And Lincoln explained to his secretary, John Hay, who was buried right here in Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, later went on to be Secretary of State to William McKinley, also of Ohio, and Theodore Roosevelt. But Lincoln said to Hay, Todd is my friend with a big head full of brains, which is a great turn of phrase, I think. Lincoln went on to say that Todd made a good governor and he's made a fortune for himself, which, to Lincoln's way of thinking, was certainly a mark in his favor. But Todd was not radical enough, as we know, given his previous opposition to abolitionism and his lukewarm support for the Emancipation Proclamation by that point. He was not radical enough for the liking of the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate, which would have had to approve his nomination to the Treasury seat, of course. And he was in fragile health himself by that point anyway, by late 1864. So he declined. Now, an Ohio historian, Delmer Trester, wrote of Todd that, quote, his administration was characterized by intense patriotism, devotion to duty, administrative ability, and unflagging energy. Ohio was fortunate to have David Todd as one of its war governors. And as with Dennison, he did really well in the job, but the politics were such that he just could not win re-election.
So now we're moving. Todd does pass not too long after the war, I believe, 5 years or so, something like that.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think that's
being
right.
in fragile health. Brough, as we've said, is a rotund man.
He is.
The monument, we get a lot of comments as people come in because the contrast between him and his two predecessors in the
Yes.
statuary is
Sort of an Abbott and Costello
it really is.
impression.
Yeah.
Or Mutt and Jeff, you might say.
Yeah, very much you get a 110 look. So you've got two very thin guys and one very round. I think the monument actually does him a pretty good job based on some
I
photographs
think so
of
too.
how large he really was.
I think it's a good image of him.
So he becomes governor as we go into his election. It is against someone you've mentioned before.
Correct. Clement Vallandigham won the Peace Democrats nomination for governor. Now, he had himself been tried and convicted by a military tribunal, and as I recall, sentenced to death. Lincoln set aside that penalty, but he, in essence, ordered that Vallandigham be exiled. He was escorted under a white flag to the lines between the U.S. and the Confederacy, and escorted across into the Confederacy. The thinking was implicitly, you like the Confederacy so much, you can go there. And he was escorted there. He then took the long way around by ship to Cuba and eventually ended up in Windsor, Ontario, right across the river from Detroit. And he ran for governor of Ohio from a hotel room in Windsor. And he campaigned largely by mail. He welcomed a steady stream of visiting Ohio Peace Democrats who could pretty easily cross into British Canada, as it was then known. And he asked in one speech, shall there be free speech, a free press, peaceable assemblages of people, and a free ballot any longer in Ohio? And even as we reject, I think rightly, his racism, his criticism of the military effort, he was asking very important questions about, how can democracy survive when the federal government and the state government, to some extent, is taking action against, very important and beloved rights that we have as Ohioans, as Americans. And desperate times call for desperate measures, but it was certainly a rallying cry for Peace Democrats to say, we are at risk of tyranny if we give Lincoln and Governor Brough everything they're looking for.
Yeah. So you talked about Brough's views on abolition
Mm-hmm.
and Vallandigham. His views are not real distant
No,
from Brough.
no.
Uh, Are we?
Bellingham is just more willing to say it. And
Yeah,
you read some of the. I read a collection of the speeches once, and you just cringe. It's just absolutely ugly, horrible, racist stuff. But it was not unusual at the time. Those sort of sentiments were expressed quite openly, and especially for those who saw the Civil War in essence as an effort to free slaves, which many of them didn't care at
yeah.
all about, and to have the follow-on economic effect of lots of freed slaves they expected would be flooding the North and perhaps taking jobs away from working class Ohioans. It was an ugly but effective political approach.
Do you think we're seeing a change in the tenor of the conversation amongst the populace because of that idea that we were going to have this economic influx? The war has been dragging on. Are we starting to see Ohio shift its views? And is that reflected in these two candidates?
It's impossible to tell, of course, before modern polling, but I think the greatest indication that it did not shift all that much is that Lincoln won re-election in 1864 with an even bigger margin than he'd won election in 1860. And for all the problems he had, which were considerable in Ohio and elsewhere, when the chips were down, Ohioans stood by Lincoln in the main, in the aggregate. But he certainly had very scathing criticism from Vallandigham and others.
Hmm.
Another indication of this, of course, that Brough beat Vallandigham, and that was by more than 100,000 votes, even considerably more than Lincoln would win the following year in his run for reelection. And among Ohio troops, which were able to vote in the field for the first time, and the Civil War, we should remember, led to the first creation of absentee balloting in the U.S. Before that time, it was expected you would only vote if you were living where you were living and could walk down the street
Yeah.
and go to your local polling sites.
A
Now,
credit to a postmaster.
yes, indeed. On the one hand, it's great.
Yeah.
Soldiers ought to be able to vote just like anybody else. I think that's certainly in keeping with the American democratic ethos. But we also have to recognize, in very raw political terms, Republicans knew they'd be getting considerable support from troops in the field.
Yeah.
And that certainly was borne out in the election of 1863 in Ohio for the governorship. Brough won by a margin of more than 18 to 1 among soldiers' votes over Vallandigham. And Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, who later had some White House experience of his own, and that was he was commanding officer of the 23rd Ohio Volunteers, and the 23rd Ohio went unanimously for Brough. Some question now, were those actually secret ballots, or could everybody see, your
Right.
messmates, your tent mates probably knew what you're going to do. They might even have actually seen your ballot. But certainly there's no question that Brough and the Union Party were heavily favored by the soldiers who were in the field, who were putting their lives on the line for a successful U.S. effort to defeat the Confederacy and restore the Union.
So as Brough said, he falls in line as a good soldier behind Lincoln,
Yes.
and becomes a very big supporter of Lincoln.
He does, and it is after his election, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, following the election returns as they came over the telegraph wire of the War Department, and finally assured of Brough's landslide victory over Vallandigham, he telegraphed the governor-elect with, I think, perhaps equal measures of relief and jubilation, and he telegraphed, quote, "Glory to God in the highest. Ohio has saved the Union." Unquote, which is just a remarkable statement. And to my knowledge, it's the only time President Lincoln singled out a single state as having saved the Union. Certainly, Ohio alone did not save the Union, but it is a reflection of the importance that the president placed on Brough's election that he would say such a thing. Lincoln was a wordsmith. He chose his words very carefully. I think he meant every one of those words.
Yeah. So Brough becomes governor, and there is still a need for soldiers. How is he and a war going on? How is he as a wartime governor?
He was, I think, just as effective as Dennison and Todd had been before him. Different style, obviously, a very different individual. Any governor, any executive, I think, puts his or her imprint on the office that they occupy. But Brough, just like Todd before him, built on Dennison's good initial work and carried the fight forward. He very strongly supported Lincoln. He was key to persuading other Midwestern governors to raise 100-day regiments in early 1864, to release more seasoned troops for duty in what was anticipated to be General Ulysses S. Grant's spring campaign in 1864. And Ohio contributed more than 34,000 men to serve 100 days. That was a real shot in the arm for the U.S. Army at the time. And among them were my great great grandfather, William Henry Vodrey, and he would lead the 143rd Ohio on garrison duty in the defenses of Washington and U.S. held Northern Virginia. An entire company from my alma mater, Oberlin College, also answered the call, and they served in fortifications around Washington as well. And Ohio was the only one of the 5 participating Midwestern states, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and Wisconsin being the others. It was the only state to actually exceed its quota for the 100-day regiments, which, given the horrendous losses up to then, and given growing Copperhead sentiment, was a remarkable achievement for Brough.
Yeah, it really is, especially in a state that is not as highly populated, and now much less so after all of these men
Right,
are sent to the war effort.
right.
Uh, so the I have a note that uh, Brough is offered the Secretary of the Treasury, uh, as was Todd.
Yes. Uh, we've already touched on Salmon P. Chase, who was a extremely ambitious guy, even for a politician. He was very ambitious, even once he was made Chief Justice of the United States by the president, who very carefully waited until after the 1864 election to ensure he was going to work hard to see Lincoln get reelected. But Chase was himself in early 64 already angling for the presidency, not very subtly. Chase had written hundreds of letters to his supporters criticizing the administration while he is serving in the cabinet. Brough got wind of this. He endorsed Lincoln. He very harshly rebuked Chase. The governor tried to convince Lincoln to refuse Chase's umpteenth resignation. This was sort of Chase's go-to ploy. He'd say, I can't stand what you're doing. I'm going to have to resign. You don't value my work. And Lincoln would soothe him and say, no, you're too important to me. You should stay on the job. But this happened one time too many. And it finally became opportune for Lincoln because of the opposition of conservative, more centrist or conservative Republicans to, in essence, to accept finally Chase's resignation. Of course, that happened up at a spot in the cabinet, and Brough and Dennison were considered for that post.
Yeah.
And Brough actually then joined forces, to his credit, with Todd and Dennison at the Unionist Party convention in Baltimore that summer. He strongly backed Lincoln. Dennison actually chaired the proceedings of the convention, and that's what endorsed Lincoln, gave him the nomination. And Brough, who was himself a former Democrat, declared his old party's platform that year as, quote, a base attempt to deceive the people of this country, and said that McClellan, who Lincoln had fired, who was by that point the Democratic nominee for president, that McClellan's military career had been a magnificent failure. And those are pretty harsh words from a governor of Ohio.
Those are pretty rough. He declines that offer to become Secretary of the Treasury, to stay in the governorship.
He did.
He's noted as being dogged in wanting to serve his state.
Correct. He worked tirelessly in support of Ohio's soldiers, like his predecessors. He visited hospitals and visited Ohio troops in the field. Went as far as Baltimore, Cincinnati, Columbus, Madison, Indiana. He pushed the legislature to grant aid to widows and orphans of those who died. He encouraged his agents to, quote, be vigilant and look well to every interest of our boys in blue. And aware that Governor Todd in particular had been beset by officers seeking promotion on the basis of either their merit, maybe, or their political pull, more often, Governor Brough instituted a promotion system based solely upon seniority, unless there was clear evidence of incompetence. But this pleased very few, and politics being politics, not unusual, he'd take some flack for that.
Yeah. So we're coming toward the end of the war. Before
Right.
the war ends, is there anything else?
Yes, well, by February 1865, the end of the war is plainly in sight. Of course, they didn't know it at that point, but it was pretty clear how things were headed. And at Governor Brough's urging, really a sharp departure from his past views, he urged the legislature to ratify the 13th Amendment with large majorities, as it turned out, in both houses, and that helped to end slavery in the United States. And at the news of Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April, that was the end of all major fighting, although the Confederacy did have other forces in the field. The state, the nation rejoiced, but then they were plunged into mourning because Lincoln was assassinated in mid-April. The slain president's body was brought by train on a long, circuitous route out of Washington, eventually through Ohio. And more than 50,000 people thronged the State House Rotunda in Columbus to see the president's remains, and twice as many packed Cleveland's public square on April 28th. And a temporary pavilion was built for the coffin to be displayed there. On the political front, the state's dominant Republicans are feeling their oats. They're thinking, why do we keep putting up former Democrats? We've got plenty of ambitious Republicans. And they knew that they didn't have to keep putting up former Democrats. And Brough could see by that point, just as Dennison and Todd did, that he was in political trouble. On June 15th, 1865, and by this point the war is almost entirely over, so he is in fact the last, if you will, wartime governor of Ohio during the Civil War. He announced that he would not seek the gubernatorial nomination, but he would not decline it if it were offered. It was not offered. And as Abbott, the historian, wrote, the Unionist Party took the governor at his word and ignored him, and it proceeded to nominate Jacob D. Cox, hero of the Battle of Franklin. Tragedy struck at this point for Brough in particular. He was working all night in his office. He stumbled in the State House yard. He bruised his hand, and he badly sprained his ankle. And he had to use a cane because he was a large man, and that caused inflammation, and gangrene set in. And pre-antibiotics, that proved to be fatal to him. And on August 29th, 1865, this would be about 5 months then after Appomattox, after prolonged suffering, as one observer noted, he died, but he had seen the Union preserved. He had guided the state out of the storm of the Civil War. Yeah. Abbott went on to say that Brough, like his two predecessors, had given his full efforts to serving the state, and he had served with energy and ability. The lieutenant governor, his name was Charles Anderson, was a former Whig, a Union candidate. He took the oath of office, and he served as governor for less than 5 months, because on January 8th, 1866, he was succeeded by Jacob Cox, who was the Union candidate in the fall of 65 rather. Anderson is notable. He should be better remembered than he is, I think. He advocated for the rights of black citizens in a way that many Ohio politicians didn't at that time. He was the first veteran to actually serve in statewide government. He'd served early in the war in uniform, and he closed out the last year of the Civil War as Ohio's governor. And a little trivia here, his brother Robert Anderson was the officer in command of Fort Sumter at the outbreak of the war. Huh. And the Andersons did their country and their state good service.
Yes. Wow. That's very interesting. So we got lucky as Ohioans.
We did.
We had three capable men who did a fantastic job of making sure that Ohio's men were well taken care of on the battlefield, and that the home front was well taken care of in their absence.
I think that's right. None of the four, if you count Anderson, were duds. Each very different men, each very different skill sets, as we would now say. But and I think it's encouraging to us as citizens of democracy that, these men who had no particular distinction before the war, not schlubs by any means, but also not, none of them would be seen as another George Washington, another Andrew Jackson. But each of them rose to the challenges and did quite well in office. But they were also simply chewed up and spat out by the politics of the day. They had to struggle to simultaneously exercise partisan leadership, fulfill the federal government's insatiable appetite for troops and war material, ensure domestic support, provide for Ohio's troops in the field, and prevent Copperhead subversion at home. And that these men did as well as they did is surprising, but I also think reassuring for anybody who cares for American democracy.
Mm. A side note on Brough, by the way, that I found I did not know and was amazed to find out when I was doing my notes on this, is buried in Woodland Cemetery.
Huh.
I don't know what the Cleveland connection is. He comes from Marietta. He's in Indiana for a while. He's got business in Cincinnati. Doesn't seem that he should be up here, but he is. Uh,
And there is a very active, I'll put in a plug for them, Woodland Cemetery Association, a
yeah,
foundation rather, and his grave is still well kept.
yes. He also attended Lincoln's casket from Cleveland to Columbus on that route, on the funeral trains route as well. So, just to give a little extra
Mm-hmm.
side note to Brough as we wrap up our wartime governors.
Sure. And one other bragging point for Ohioans, if I may, is that an Ohioan, Jacob Parrott, was the first to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and that was for his participation in the Andrews Raid, the great locomotive chase in Georgia during the war. A number of the men involved in the Andrews Raid were Ohioans.
Fantastic. Uh, any other final thoughts about the governors?
I think it's just a inspiring story if you really look into it. It's encouraging, as I said, that these three men would do as well as they could, given the many challenges thrown at them. It would not have been terribly surprising for at least one of them to sort of, throw up his hands and say, this is impossible. How can I conceivably do what is being asked of me? To serve those many masters, to multitask and do all of it pretty well, despite some bumps in the road,
Mm,
and to keep Ohio very firmly committed to the U.S. war effort, despite the threat that Copperheadism posed here.
very well said. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Thank all of you for joining us as well. Please come by the monument, see our three wartime governors in the bronze, and maybe we should add a fourth. But we are open 7 days a week, 10 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. at the monument. We are always having our special events for things like Memorial Day. We have our annual tunnel tours coming up soon. So check our website, soldiersandsailors.com, for all of those great events. Also, take a look at the website for the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable. It's a great resource, which, if you're a fan of this podcast, you've seen two of our guests so far have been fantastic additions to our conversation. And I want to thank you, Judge William Vodrey, for your participation today. And we'll see you soon.
I'm glad to, Greg. Thank you for having me.